My name is Dr. Valda Harris Montgomery. Um, I'm a native of Montgomery, Alabama, um, born in 1947 right here in the city, and have been in and out of the neighborhood or out of the city, so to speak, throughout my life, but basically based still here in the city of Montgomery. I was born in a neighborhood here in Montgomery called Centennial Hill, which was the affluent African American neighborhood of mostly the prominent people, Black people here in Montgomery, dating back to the 1870s. In fact, my great grandfather was an Alabama state senator during Reconstruction. His name was John William Jones. He was Secretary of the Senate from 1872 to 1876, and he owned a large amount of the property in Centennial Hill near what we call the Apex at High and South Jackson Street. I'm saying that because it's no surprise that Dexter Avenue Church would build their parsonage in that neighborhood. And it just so happened that the Dexter parsonage was two doors down from my home house, where my father grew up and all of the above. So anybody that's assigned to be the minister of that church lives in that house. So when I was about 4 years old or so, maybe five, the family that was there was Reverend Vernon Johns and his family. And so, because this is a neighborhood, we always like to stress the fact that this was a neighborhood. Um, we were in and out of homes and like children. And then when I turned 6, after the Johns family moved, and I'm 6 years old, the new couple moves in. And they were newlyweds, and that newlywed couple was Dr. Martin Luther King and his wife, Coretta. So from that point on, that was in 1954, that was like my start of meeting this civil rights icon um, that everybody knows in the world. But for me, he was like an Uncle Martin in the neighborhood. Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta King, as I stated earlier, were newlyweds. There were no children involved. A year later, however, their first child, their daughter, was born. Yolanda was born in November 17th, to be exact, of 1955. 2 weeks later, December the 1st of 1955, if anybody is studying civil rights history at all, they should know that that's the day that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, which catapulted the modern civil rights movement. However, that was also something special to me because it was my birthday and I was 8 years old. And I thought all of this excitement or whatever flavor in the air was all about me, and that you were planning this birthday party for me, and only to find out, no, this is the birth of something greater than you, which was the modern civil rights movement. So, because of that day and the neighbors that we had, which were Dr. King and Coretta King, and the incident and event of that day, my life was thrown into civil rights movement until today. I often speak to audiences, especially children, to make them understand, first of all, that the civil rights movement was not something that happened overnight, and that most of the events that they see on TV or read in movies or on documentaries uh, did not happen overnight. This was over a period of years. As I stated earlier, I'm 8 years old when the boycott starts, but I'm 13 years old in 1961 of May of 1961 when the Freedom Riders from Nashville, the group from Nashville, come to Montgomery at the Greyhound bus station, and they are so badly attacked, so badly beaten and bruised and attacked with a white mob that met the bus. They were beaten with bats and chains and any kind of object that you could get other than a gun. I never heard there being gunfire, but just objects that they could be beaten with, severely beaten with. Um, Eventually, that group spread out to go to homes and then came back together again to go to First Baptist Church, the Black First Baptist Church, Reverend Abernathy's church, for a scheduled mass meeting um, to talk about what the plans were when leaving Montgomery, how to get to Jackson, to strategize and see what was happening. Well, we know that that was disrupted a little bit because of the event. However, the mass meeting was still taking place. And when the Freedom Riders were there, the congregation and some of the members of the congregation um, wanted to protect them, so they put them in choir robes so that the mob came through the church to find them. They couldn't really identify them because this same mob, which grew to be from 300 to almost 3,000 people, surrounded the church, breaking stained glass windows, turning over cars, setting cars afire because they really wanted to get to them, lynch them, and kill these outside agitators, so to speak. Inside the church were not only the Freedom Riders that were there, which included John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, etc., were your leaders, which was Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Wyatt T. Walker, James Farmer, etc., and 1,500 people that were in the church for this mass meeting. Because that mob was outside, in a sense, they held them hostage and started breaking, as I said, breaking the windows, tear gas, and all inside the church, trying to drive the rioters out. Martin Luther King was in the basement on the phone with Robert Kennedy to ask for help to get him to federalize the troops. And ultimately, that was done after long negotiations. That was done. And the trucks, National Guard trucks, came by about 4 o'clock that next morning to start getting people out. And they loaded the Freedom Riders on the trucks and they brought them to our house. Okay, so our house proved to be the safe place. Now, I'm 13 years old. I'm standing watching this group of people come down a hallway, bloodied, battered, beaten, exhausted. Um, that was that connection. People often ask, were you ever afraid? And I said, never. Fear was never a word that I can even associate with, entire civil rights movement. Or were you surprised that this number of people are coming in your house? And I said, no, because we always had a large group of people. The house was built for people, and we just always had people in the house. So this was not unusual, nor was it unusual to see the sights of people that had suffered during a protest because we had already been through the Montgomery bus boycott for 300 plus days. And then Alabama State is right down the street, so you have sit-ins and protests coming down the street. So this was not unusual either. However, the sight of seeing them so exhausted and just spent was something that I will never forget. But they were there with us for about 3 days because when the initial group came from Nashville, the word got out to tell you where the safe house was. And we started getting more and more. The number count continued to increase coming from New Orleans, people flying in, James Farmer's coming in, C.T. Vivian's already there. So you've got all of these leaders that are there in the house. And this is where they're strategizing. And you've got multiple floors in the house. And so you have a level where the leaders can sit and discuss and make the plans and bring them to the students, which included, as I said, John Lewis. And one of the most famous photos that you see of him, John Lewis, is with the bandage on the back of his head, the white bandage, sitting on the floor, and that's in the house. So this was something to experience. And then on that last day, they met in the kitchen with Reverend A.D. King giving a prayer, surrounded in the kitchen for a prayer breakfast, and lined up going down the hall to get back onto the trucks, the National Guard trucks, to go to the Trailway and Greyhound bus stations, to go to Jackson, Mississippi. And my mom said they looked like lambs going to the slaughter, so she was very worried about them. But I found out later as well that the decision that was made for them to continue with the Freedom Rides, with all of the negotiations and tension, was done in that house. And see, because you grow up with it, it's like, oh, no big deal. This happens all the time. And it really wasn't until documentaries started to surface, the video footage that was done while we were growing up and going to school and seeing all of it, witnessing it, um, started to bring it home to make it a reality of how serious this was and how our lives actually were in jeopardy at that time, and the courageous act of my parents to open the doors for this. As an adult, I reflect back on um, my experiences with the civil rights movement and often wonder what was it about my parents that allowed themselves to do this. Well, my dad um, comes from that family with, as I said, with my grandfather being a legislator and finding out that they had a civil rights movement back in 1875, of which my grandfather was a part of, and that had to do with the desegregation of some of the public facilities like theaters at that time. But then, of course, Reconstruction, as in Jim Crow, and all of that died out. My dad was a member of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was with the 99th group after he graduated from Fisk University. He was in Chicago to study mathematics, to get his master's in mathematics when the war broke out for them to sign up or whatever. And he was one that was selected to be a part of that Tuskegee experiment for flight. And so he became a Tuskegee Airman. He was with the same class with, I think he's a brigadier general now, Charles McGee, but they were all in the same class together, 43F. So, because of the experiences that they had to endure through that training and going from base to base, the racial discriminations, things that they had to endure, I have a tendency to believe that that's a lot of the uh, impetus, I should say, that my dad had to be a strong part of the civil rights movement because he never wavered. He never wavered at all. Um, my mom lived in Charleston, South Carolina. And when my dad was stationed in Walterboro, South Carolina, which was 45 minutes away, that's how he met her because he went to Charleston to actually visit one of his friends from college. And she wasn't there. And my mom was, as my mom would tell that story. I met him and I kept him. That's the way she would say it. But he brought her to Montgomery. And I often wonder what she thought about because I would ask her what was the situation in Charleston, South Carolina, because we all know what Charleston was about. But she would say that it was the South and it was segregation. She said it was the South, but it wasn't the deep South. So she made that comparison, but she never once um, went against my dad's wishes. Just one of those supportive, whatever needed to be done, and they just functioned as a unit. That's about the only way that I can describe them. Extremely, Martin Luther King was an extremely warm and loving man, especially to children. He loved the kids on the block. And because we were in and out of that house when the Johns family was there, we felt we could go in and out of that house when the King family moved in, which is exactly what we did. Um, when he went to India, for instance, and came back from that trip, and he had all these slides, he'd call us down and we'd watch the slides. And anytime he was in the neighborhood, we would find him so that we could get a hug, or he'd be down at the house talking with my mom. But my greatest memory of him that still, I want to say, kind of haunts me today, bothers me today, is when he was stabbed with the letter opener in New York at the book signing. And at that time, I didn't know, media didn't cover all of that for us, so we didn't know what was going on. But when he was back in town, and he was down at the house, and I was going down the house to go see him, just to say, hey, get a hug or whatever. And I rang the doorbell, and he answered the door. And this time when he answered the door, he didn't have on a shirt. He was covered with gauze all the way across. And I was taken aback And he said, "Don't worry, I'm okay. I'm fine. Come on in, sweetie, give me a hug." But the image of seeing him like that just showed me how, I guess, how vulnerable he was and how he could be killed. And this is in the 50s, to the point that when I went to Washington, D.C. to see the unveiling of the marker, and he's standing like this. And I said, no, all I could see was the man standing in the doorway. And yeah, that's my greatest memory of him. John Lewis was actually, to me, was like a big brother because he really wasn't that much older than I was. And so when we met him in at the house, I don't know why he stood out anyway. He was right along with all the rest of them, but for some reason he stood out. And there was no interaction with any of them other than like we're doing now. Or if they're talking, they bring you in because you're the kid, the family member, and you're talking all the above. But when he had his book signing, for instance, here in Montgomery years ago, and I was standing in line, and I knew him. I knew him. I said, "John Lewis, I know John Lewis. He was in our house, John Lewis, because he was growing in fame." And I said, "I know John Lewis." Oh, I remember John. He was in my house, and I was standing waiting to get my book signed. And when I got the turn, I told him. I got to the front, and I said, "I'm the daughter of the man that gave you your first beer." And when I said that, he jumped up and came and gave me this big hug, which let me know that he still had memories of being in the house and being with the family. And he remembered me as being, quote, the little girl, of which I was 13, and he's 19 or 20. So that's a large gap then, but not so much as we got to be older. And so anytime he would come to Montgomery, he would come by to see my mom. He really, really loved my mom. He always thanked her, and he would come in tears and thank her for the courage that she had to open the doors for them. But that was and when they would come with the Faith and Politics group every year in March, and we'd see them and we'd get big hugs. And when my mom passed, he and Bernice King both wrote letters to the family, about their experiences and with my mom and with my parents. When John Lewis came recently, um, it was in March for the bridge crossing, the annual bridge crossing that they do. He was in his last stages with the pancreatic cancer that was taking his life. Um, I think the fact that he made it a point to be there, knowing that this might be his last time, shows the courage that he had throughout this entire civil rights movement and his involvement. What a courageous person that he was. Um, to see him there was what it's hard to say what the emotions that everybody felt that he's a diehard, so to speak. He's a diehard for the cause, and that we must still continue with the cause, with the movement in any way that we can. We cannot let it die. We cannot let it die. And that it's a shame that it's still being fought all these years later. We are fighting exactly the same fight. And I think that's what his image to me showed on that last day when he wanted to do that final bridge crossing. Because I had been exposed to the civil rights movement at the early age of 8 with the boycott and Martin Luther King family, um, and then being our neighbors for 6 years. So very much involved with whatever was going on and watching it and learning from it. And then with the Freedom Riders being in our house again, watching and learning from it. In 1962, 63, so to speak, I'm in high school now. Okay. And in high school, we had started going to classes or workshops in the basements of churches to learn the nonviolent method, the nonviolent direct action method. It was called a Freedom School, and we had a little booklet that was written by Martin Luther King, and we had some of the local leaders to start to teach us. So we were learning how to respond, how not to respond, and knowing the difference in a reaction and a response. Reaction is quick, no thought. The response takes a little bit of thought to make you think to how am I going to get out of this situation, or how do I handle this situation? And so we learned how to remain stoic. We learned how to take verbal abuse. We learned how to fall from a stool in a fetal position. We learned how to march on the sidewalk, how many abreast you can sit, two abreast on the sidewalk, say 6 or 7 on the street. You learned that if you saw someone in front of you that maybe wanted to say, make it 3 abreast, you would tap them, pull them back, so that you didn't want to do anything to violate the law. You had to really do everything you did was legal, and you just learned how to work within that. So 63, of course, you have just the children in Birmingham, and the Children's March in Birmingham. So the training that they were getting in Birmingham was the same thing we were getting here in Montgomery. So in 1964, technically, my going into my senior year, so it's the summer of 64, Civil Rights Act or bill is passed that summer of July. We're ready. I mean, the ink is not dry, and we're going to go and sit in a diner, which is exactly what we did. And we're getting exactly the same treatment that we had prepared ourselves for. Get your menu, and you get the lady saying, we don't serve N words here. And you're saying, that's fine. We weren't going to order that. We just like a cup of water or something of that page. And so we sat, it was about 5 of us at that time, until they called the police, and the police came. They didn't arrest us, but they ushered us out. But we were not going to leave. And we did the same thing at the movie theaters. The movie theaters, we got in, we sit in the seats, and this white crowd, teenagers, buy the popcorn and the candy and the drinks, and they did all of this, and they pour it on you, and you have already been trained to take it. And you're just saying to yourself with a smile, you all are really wasting your money because we're going to sit here and watch this movie. And we do. Same with the drive-in or anything that we could possibly get our hands on to test the laws to see, can we get in? And that's what we did. And that was, as I said, the summer of 64, leading into my senior year. And then, of course, the spring semester of senior year in March is Selma. The Selma to Montgomery March comes in to play. Again, we're ready. We're all set and ready. We did not go to Selma because we're still in school. However, the march is coming to us at St. Jude Educational Institute, where I'm a senior. And we walk out of school. We walk out of school on that week before, because that was the march that where a group gathered at Alabama State University. So you had SNCC that was there, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You had members of the SCLC. You had students from high schools and from college that had gathered there to walk down to Judge Frank Johnson's office to make sure that he would provide an injunction to protect these walkers or these marchers to come across the Edmund Pettus Bridge this third go round, because the first time was Bloody Sunday, the second time they were turned around, and this third time it's like, no, we're going to do this time. So of course that was granted, and a week later was when the official march came in from Selma to Montgomery. There's a picture that depicts that, and it's often being misused as the Selma to Montgomery March, but it actually is not. That's the picture that has Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, John Lewis, an albino minister, Reverend Jesse Douglas, James Palmer, all locked arm in arm, coming down. Actually, they're coming down Jackson Street, coming from Alabama State University. And people say, did you see that? Because they're coming right in front of our house. And that's why we knew that this was not the Selma to Montgomery March because we were in it. But that's the one that you see, that picture, um, or you'll see so much footage of a march in Montgomery. Again, they're all coming down Jackson Street, and it was a very large march at that time. But prior to that, there were a lot of marches in that neighborhood, complete with Klan coming down the street and horses and all of the above that we had to experience. With Judge Frank Johnson, um, his name has come up so much in any of the events that we talk about with the civil rights movement. For me, the first time that I actually really heard his name was with the Selma to Montgomery March back in the day when I heard his name. As I've learned more about the incidents that have happened with the bus boycott and with the freedom rides, his name continues to come into play. So I'm learning who this man is. Ironically, my very first teaching job here in Montgomery was at Houston Hill Junior High, and the librarian was his wife, Ruth Johnson. Judge Frank Johnson had several rulings throughout this modern civil rights movement. Um, I think the one that I would say was the most significant for me would have been the one with the Selma to Montgomery March, and mainly because of the video footage. Because had he not made the ruling, and had we not had it complemented with the immediate coverage, I don't think that our civil rights movement would have gained any traction. I don't think that those bills would have been signed by the president. The Voting Rights Act. I could say the Civil Rights Act, even though that was the year prior to that. I think here again, with the freedom rides and with the um, bus boycott, it was little gains. They were major when you read about it, but nobody knew about it. And so you're getting what you want, but it's so slow. And it's not until people can actually see what's going on and that this is affecting the nation, the world, even, of how people are being treated. I would have to say that particular one for the Selma to Montgomery March, allowing those marchers to come across the bridge and ultimately down the Capitol to Dexter Avenue to the Capitol, for the public to see that, the major public to see what was going on, to start to change things. Because when you talk with the average person, ask them about the civil rights movement, or where do you think it all began? I can guarantee you 8 out of 10 are going to say Selma. They're going to say Selma, or they're going to say Birmingham. Montgomery is never mentioned, but yet you'll say Rosa Parks. So that's the part that I find very interesting. So I still would have to say Selma, that Selma ruling, Selma to Montgomery March ruling was probably the most effective to me. Growing up, I don't remember hearing his name that much, and I would imagine that I would have heard his name being mentioned through my dad and his friends. But here again, I was a child, so you didn't engage in adult conversation. You could, as they say, kind of eardrop trying to hear if you were interested in being nosy, so to speak. But that our parents were more responsible for keeping us safe, and the discussions were about people, and those involved was never talked about, especially those that were white. We didn't know the good from the bad. A lot of times we would hear the names of uh, definitely the mayor or the governor or a police commissioner or a police officer, and they were all being talked about in negative sense. So if somebody were to say, even mention the name Frank Johnson, in my mind at that time, it would still be, well, what is he going to do? Only to find out, as I said, later in life exactly how important he was to the civil rights movement. I would have to describe the importance of Frank Johnson in his rulings because again, all of these movements had lawyers, had black lawyers, especially like Fred Gray, Solomon Say, Charles Langford, all of these groups that took on the civil right the different events like the boycott and the freedom rides here locally, or even the protests that we have that's not being talked about so much. They still had to come to him, and without his rulings, um, final rulings, uh, none of this would matter. It was always about him making it and being fair and sticking to the letter of the law, the rule of the law, to make sure that this is carried out, that you just can't make up your own laws and decide you want to follow it. No. So I would have to say it would have been because of him. Um, Higher ups were listening to him. Let's put it that way. Anybody that was higher up that could make a definite ruling, um, he was a person that they would listen to. He was like a face of, and at that time you really needed a white face for these kinds of things to happen. The Freedom Riders Museum is a special place for me. Um, Mainly because I knew the story prior to anybody else. And here in Montgomery, that story of the Freedom Rides was not one that was even talked about. People didn't even know about the Freedom Rides in Montgomery. I'm going to be honest with you until the documentary came out that Ray Arsenault did in the 90s. No, in 2011. Let me go back into 2011. That the real story overall started to come into play. I knew it because I grew up with it, had direct involvement with it, and we knew about the Greyhound bus station. But we also knew about the Greyhound bus station of the treatment that we got if we wanted to ride the bus to go to college or whatever. So all of that was very true. And then it stayed closed, it's just shut down completely, or I think it was operable at one period of time, but because of the negative tone that I had experienced with it, I really didn't pay much attention to it by then. But when the talk came about to save it, I was all for it. And Ellen Mertens is was one of the people that worked for the Alabama Historic Commission, and she knew my story as well as Dorothy Walker, who was at that time over at Alabama State, and I was at Alabama State with the patrons organization as well as a associate professor over there. So I had my hands in the bucket, so to speak, with that too. But it was Ellen Mertens and Dorothy that started that chatter. And once they started getting the Freedom Rides Museum um, underway and the plans were secured, uh, as well as from Judge Myron Thompson getting, okay, his was in on this as well. Then they asked me, we started forming the Friends of the Freedom Rides so that we could have some type of funding support group for the group. And I was extremely glad to be a part of that. And automatically you get to be the president. So um, I'm the president of the Friends of the Freedom Rides Museum, which I absolutely love having that position because of the experiences that I had and being able to be a part of sharing this story to others and to make sure that you have the money for the programs that we're wanting to do. And I'm not the only one. Trust me. It's just we have an excellent team, an excellent board, and I just sometimes just follow their lead. Or what do you want me to do? That I'm there for it. But that's my passion. I think anything that has to do with the struggles that we have had, the blood that has been shed, for us to move forward to the rights and privileges that we have today needs to be preserved, and people need to know about it. I think the Freedom Rides Museum is has really played a role in that, especially highlighting the works of John Lewis, because as he has risen in, I don't want to use the word fame, let's say notoriety of being a person that's an icon as well. Um, Now we have tourists that come to Montgomery, and the Freedom Rides Museum is one of the places that they want to see because they associate him with the Freedom Rides. Again, they mainly associated him with the Selma to Montgomery March, but when the Freedom Ride stories started to surface, that's what I mean when I said these stories are starting to surface. Tourists are starting to come into town, and they want to see all of the places that we have where blood was shed, and especially the Freedom Rides Museum, because that story is being told, um, more often than it was before. Thank you, thank you, just thank you, because he could have said no. He could have said, "I'm not. I don't want to get involved," like so many of the others did. Um, we would still be at a standstill. If it wasn't for him, I might not have been able to go to, say, Auburn. You know, couldn't go in the 60s, when I graduated, or places like that. Because of him, we can vote. Because of him, you don't have to look over your shoulder to see if somebody's coming, behind you to do some of the atrocities that we had to endure. Because of him, we can get on a bus and sit and ride and not worry about who's sitting next to me or who's sitting behind me. So the freedoms that I'm feeling right now um, is because of him. And that's why I said I would like to just simply say thank you. And that's really not enough. I don't know what else can be said other than thank you. As I said, she was a librarian when my first years teaching, so I'm young coming out of college. And she just embraced any of the new teachers that were there. Just such a pleasant person. Uh, we had a tight knit faculty of which she was a part of. And so anytime we would all do things like bring goodies or treats or have special thing for the students, um, she was always one that would be involved. She was highly respected. She wasn't there that long. I was there for 8 years. I want to say she might have um, been there for 2 years, the first 2 years that I was there before, another librarian replaced her. But that was my first meeting with her was Rick Lou Johnson. I still had no idea. Okay, so you're married to Frank Johnson. Okay, so you know, um, but it was just her. She was just that kind of approachable, kind woman. No, I don't think that she would have said don't. She wasn't that kind of person. Uh, and the reason I would say that is because here again, when I first started teaching, this is when schools were being integrated. Okay. If she didn't want to be around, she was at a black school. Okay, so she was the librarian at Houston Hill Junior High School, which was primarily a black school in the black neighborhood. I want to say in Centennial Hill, but it was in Houston Hill, which borders Centennial Hill, but still the black neighborhood. Um, and she could have easily have been like some of those people that I grew up with, some of the white women that wouldn't want to ride on the bus or tell you, no, you can't have this or you can't try on a hat or anything like that. And that was not what she was about. Her personality, my impression of her personality would not have lent itself to be anti anything that he wanted to do. So it seemed like she was not only supportive, but I would think she would have been a sounding board, somebody that would, because she was not just, no, that wasn't what she wasn't, but she wasn't this kind of person. But you could still tell that she had a strong personality of support, and that if he needed um, another point of view. What do you think? That she would be there to give that to him. Much like Reverend Gratz and Mrs. Jean Gratz. I don't know if you know them, the white minister, Lutheran minister that was here during the bus boycott, and his wife Jean Gratz, and they raised all these children and had to deal into all of these bombings. They were like this. You didn't see one without the other. Did you remember them? Can you know him? They were always holding hands until they recently passed about 2 years ago. She was just more recent than him. Um, but she was right always in his corner. Um, Also, to another side note, is that I asked my mother, I asked Mrs. Gratz, and I asked Juanita Abernathy and all, you know, what did you do? Because their names are not the ones that's out there. Okay. What was your role? Because people know them. You were the wife of. See, all of them said, well, our role was to make sure that the family was intact because everybody had like 3 and 4 children, Coretta King, same way, that the family is intact. Not saying that they were meek and mild by any means, but their job was to make sure that when the husband came home from all of this tension and hatred and making these decisions and putting their life out online, that when they came home, that the children were okay and safe. We're going to do our normal routine, have dinner around the table, or breakfasts, or whatever that might be. And I imagine Mrs. Johnson being that kind of woman, supportive. I don't know if they had children. Did they have children? One son? Okay. So yeah, I would imagine that that's the kind of interaction that they would have had behind closed doors. You just don't forget. You don't forget. And so many questions that students ask or people ask. And one of the major ones is, weren't you scared? And I said, never once, even from a little girl, did we ever feel fear. And especially during the boycott, um, because you had so many people, everybody was like one big, huge family of, what did they say, 50,000 people that participated in it. And you could go all over the Black neighborhood. And I said, in order for you to understand what that was like, you have to understand segregation. There were no white people in this pool. You have a family of 50,000 people. No matter where you go, they're going to straighten you up, send you home, or give you this hug or whatever. And you always felt secure. You always felt secure. Even with the bombings that went on, that was one of the things that that I yeah, I remember that a lot. The first bombing at his home in 1956, that January of 1956, people ask, were you at home? And I tell them, yeah, we 2 doors down. So if he gets damaged, we're going to get collateral damage as well. We saw the crowd gather out front. We saw him come and stand on the porch. We didn't come outside because I'm still young, 8 years old, but we're nosy. And so you're peeking out the door and you see the crowd. But my mom did go out and my dad came home from the drugstore. Um, the very next year, 1957, again, January, the boycott has ended and people are not happy. So they're going to bomb some more. And they bombed on January the 10th and January the 27th. January the 10th was the day that they bombed all of those churches. And you could lay in the bed and see bombs going off, all of the churches in the pastors' homes. January 27th was the night that they had 12 sticks of dynamite on King's porch that did not go off, thank God. But the one across the street at People's Cab Stand, which was right across the street from where we lived, did go off. And at that time, my sister and I were staying with my grandmother in this big white house right next to the quote senator's house, there, because my mom and my dad were on their way to Charleston so my mom could take care of her mother who was about to have surgery. They took my little brothers with them. And that bomb went off. And at that time, because of the way that the house is like a big Victorian kind of house with lots of windows, 14 windows in her house shattered all around at the same time. You're listening to this. And there was a the canvas shades. You remember those kind of canvas pull down shades? They were in the bedroom because we were asleep. A triangular piece of glass came down and the shade caught it, because if it had not caught it, it would have gotten me right here in the bed. Okay. It took me a long time to get over the sound of breaking glass. I mean, you talk about PTSD, and see, nobody ever asked, what did the children feel during this movement? That's why I wrote a book about it. It's called Just a Neighbor, because they always ask, what was it like to live down the street from Dr. King? He was just a neighbor, and then I tell the story, same kind of what I just got through saying, um, of what our experiences were like as a child. And you don't forget it. You never forget that. And it's very similar to when they asked Ruby Bridges, who integrated in New Orleans, how did you feel? And she said, I just thought this was about Mardi Gras. That's your mentality, as far as you know, is that they're setting up this, people are yelling like it's Mardi Gras time. And these were the kinds of things that we were experiencing as well. And it stays with you. She hasn't forgotten about it. I haven't forgotten about it. And my girlfriend that rode the bus with me, not the bus, rode the train with me, we're going to Fisk University in 65, that September. LNN comes from Montgomery, goes to Birmingham, straight up to Nashville. She gets on in Birmingham. We become friends instantly. Don't know each other, but we all going to the same place. And why we struck up an argument, not an argument, a conversation about the civil rights movement and the bombing. And I said, well, I lived down the street from Martin Luther King. Well, I did this. Well, we had a bombing here. We're going back and forth like who had the best civil rights movement, I guess, something like that. And she taught me when she said, I was in the church and she got the call. And the call was to say, you got 3 minutes. She had just left the girls down in the basement and come up to prepare the altar. And she got the call. They said, you've got 3 minutes. And of course, then everything exploded. Well, again, we're going to Fisk in 65. This happened 2 years prior, 63. We never shared what was going on in our minds. I mean, the campus is really close, so we're right next door. We weren't roommates, but you're in this room and I'm in that room, and we just grew up together. And it wasn't until we became adults, really, during this 2000s years, that we started to say how this was affecting us. And we never shared it with anybody because you thought, okay, this is over. We don't want to relive this again. And then she wrote a book, and it's called While the World Watch. She was on Oprah with hers. And then, then I told her, I said, I'm not looking for Pulitzer Prize or anything. I just got to get it off of my chest and to put it in print. Ran into one of the Little Rock Nine. I can't think of her name, but she had come by the house while visiting the sites, and she came by my mom's house, visit with my mom. And we were sitting and talking about the same thing. She said, I said, you wrote a book too? She said, I just had to get it off my chest. So all of us are talking about what we experienced as children because it's in you. You can't help it. And so when George Floyd was murdered and all of this tension and everything started coming, I know I stayed in tears. I cried and cried and cried and cried because please, Lord, don't let this happen again. Because that's all you could think about was my grandchildren are getting ready to live these little children that they were filming, that you would see them standing and you just break down in tears going, God, I don't want them to have to go through this. I don't want them to have to go through this. And then my son and my children who are in their 40s, son is getting ready to turn 50, but late 40s. And when all of that was happening, he said, Mama, you didn't prepare us for this. I said, because we thought we had won this battle. We didn't think we had to ever go through this again. But then I've got a grandson who's going through it, and he's getting called the N-word and all the stuff. He's in high school and college. And so when I started doing the talk to people, it was always young students, mixed students, diverse group of people, young ones, that Generation Z group. They would ask, I'm just so angry. I'm just so angry. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And I'd say, you know what? Change that word anger to passion. Don't lose the feeling, but lose the purpose, lose the way you're going to channel that. Because you've got to be passionate. We cannot make any changes unless you're passionate about what you're doing and you got to educate yourself on how you do it. We didn't just wake up and decide, hey, I think we'll protest. No, you had to learn. You had to go to school, you had to learn exactly how this is supposed to go. It's a movement that had to be studied. And but when asking, when just recently we had a group from Oakland, California, Martin Luther King Freedom Center, and that's what they were talking about. They were in the house doing. They came there for a purpose to do strategy sessions in the space that the Freedom Riders did their strategy sessions. And so part of theirs was to do their assignment from their supervisor was to do like a poetry or a read or something like that, and everybody to get in their deep thoughts. And one of them was saying that she said, yeah, because see, my mom doesn't understand any of this. I have to just tell her about it. She doesn't understand. And I had to stop her right there. So, wait, let me tell you why your mom doesn't understand. Your mom doesn't understand because your mom is my children's generation. They didn't enjoy this. None of this happened to them. They came into a world of integration. They went to school. They made friends. They spent the night. They had a wonderful time. And now, and all of that supremacy and all was somewhere we thought buried for good, but it started to rise up again. And it's affecting the next generation. And of course, it's affecting them that because they are the parents of that next generation and they don't know what to do. They're at a loss.